this will now.
Yeah, we can use an all.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's working.
But this isn't live.
This is what we're sending now.
Okay. Is
So
it
this
public?
is yes. So we need to stop this because it finished the wrong thing.
Can we just change the name of that thing? Or not?
Okay.
Should we put like a placeholder or something?
Yeah. No. We can change the name of it. I don't know where this has come from.
Put it like that. Can we always change the name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's what cash week is.
I've extensively looked at the floor plan, don't you worry.
Right, so now I need to create a holding screen.
Can you just do here? Can you not make a white background and text just say Cash Week 2019 live stream starting soon? Do you know what I mean?
There was a way to do that, yes.
Yeah, you just add.
I haven't done. Okay, I turned it off anyway. I just cut it to black.
Yeah.
Or not. That's just a layout.
last year was a bit of an experiment, and the experiment worked rather well, so hence the gathering again today. And it's really good to see in the room, and I know lots more are still coming, people from the diversity of the health network. So we have amongst us people from the Red Cross, from NGOs, from the UN, from private sector, and delighted, and especially that we have some from academia as well, a section that we've not always managed to attract into the room as well as we would like. So welcome all of you. It's really nice as well to see people, lots of familiar faces, you know, nice lots of hugs going on, and, you know, as somebody just said, the social event of the cashier. So lots of meets and greets and getting along, but also lots of new faces for me anyway, and that's really nice. So that's about us trying to also make sure we're broadening this conversation, not just talking to ourselves. So thank you for that. And if you're new into the room, hopefully you'll be meeting and greeting with hugs next year. We decided to hold this event based on the success of last year, where you really talked about the value of having a space where you could pause, reflect, and really think about sort of the progress we're making. The speed with which sessions sold out this year was phenomenal, and a real testament to the interest there. Don't be put off by the number of empty spaces there. They will be filling up during the course of the morning. And thank you for your patience, anybody who struggled with the wait listing system, but we had to be rigorous in making sure we'd got diversity coming in. This year, as well as the exciting agenda that we've got here in London, there are also some events that have already taken place in other parts of the world. So there's been events in Panama and Dakar already, and more events are planned this week in Nairobi and Amman. We also have events live streamed, so we hope that people from the world, around the world, will join in with that. So it's not about just live streaming, but a possibility of participation. And with that in mind, as well as sharing your thoughts in the room, please do feel free, you know, share your thoughts on social media and use that hashtag Cash Week 2019. And let's see if we can get a little bit of a conversation going online as well. So what do we have in store? I'm not going to go through the full agenda. I think that's going to be flashed up any moment, but let me pick out some highlights. The agenda is really driven by some of the key themes that emerged last year. So last year there was an absolutely excellent panel discussion that challenged us to be more effective today by asking the right questions about the future. And some of you will remember that was sitting there in the ODI panel. It was and it was also a video online. So if you haven't watched it, it's still one worthy of going back and taking, and that's very rare that I would recommend to go back and watch a video of a panel discussion. But it was absolutely awesome, and I would really recommend that. Really good for engaging with your teams on some key thoughts. And that session marked the start of a journey, really. And we've travelled some distance in that journey now, and I'm delighted we're opening the event very shortly with the launch of the Future of Financial Assistance report, a summary of which you've got, or some of the highlights on your chairs. This report looks to the future, exploring the future and ways of which we're going to be working with cash. And it challenges us. It challenges us all as it maps out a changing world. I think there's some pretty fundamental questions in there, questions that we've got to ask and ask ourselves, are we ready for that degree of change? Last year, you also said that scaling up cash and vouchers has the potential to strengthen the humanitarian system. So it's not just about CVA, it's about how as a system, how as a humanitarian world can we effect change. Cash, and many of you in this room are change agents. But we recognise that this also means that we need to work differently. Working together means that not everybody should be doing the same thing. You know, there's no point in everybody herding into the same place. It also means some of us have got to give up things. Are we ready for that? Fundamentally, we need to stop competing over market share, as we talked about, and start competing over impact. That's going to mean significant change. There has been change in the last year. So tomorrow, we will be looking at different ways of working, some of the new emerging operational models. Look at some of these collaborative approaches, the best evidence that's there, and ask about how these can be made to work best for people in crisis. Are they really working best for people in crisis, or are they working best for agencies? Let's explore and prod that question. You know, they may or may not be the same answers. Last year, you said the future is digital, and that we're still analog. We recognise the need that we need to learn quickly, and we need to avoid doing digital harm. It's great to have more digital specialists in the room this time round. Building on that, a lot of work has taken place in the last year. On Wednesday, we then opened with a session on data responsibility and risks. It's been a key focus and one where urgent action is needed. I remember at one of the meetings a discussion around, you know, we've had paper-based genocide. Has the digital genocide already taken place? Is it about there? You know, this is the kind of risk that we're talking about if we don't get some of the data responsibility issues right. Last year, you said we need to take localization more seriously. You told us that success criteria for humanitarian actors should include opportunities to support others to take a leading role. It's not just about the international agencies taking a leading role. It's supporting others. It's changing our position. We would have loved to have seen more local actors in the room today. Managed a few more. Sadly, some were thwarted by visas, so we failed a bit there. But we've also tried to make sure that conversation is reaching further. But what does that mean as we try to go to scale? On Wednesday, we will look at how localization commitments sit with the issue of scaling up cash. How do they fit together? Can they fit together? Are they challenging one another? And that discussion will be echoed in Nairobi, where localization is also a focus of a discussion there. All of these and many other points on the agenda are very big issues. On our own, no single agency can make the degree of change we need. And if we're really serious about these issues, then there has to be system-wide change. It's not just about how does my agency do better, it's how do we all do better together. That sets the stage for the discussions on Thursday, where we'll explore what as a network we can do and achieve more. I look forward to a week packed with big ideas, bold challenges, a week that I hope will strengthen friendships, strengthen partnerships, and foster new ones. I hope we will think out of the box and challenge ourselves to be better, so that we're setting a program for development for the next year, so that next year we come back and we say, yeah, we have made progress. Before I can conclude, I want to set you all a challenge. In every discussion, I want you to ask yourselves, what does this look like from the perspective of people in need, people in crisis? Is this the best solution that we could have? What would this mean for them? What do they need? How do they prefer to receive assistance? It's not just what do I need, it's what do I want? How do I want it? How can we build that and plan and design, not just from our own perspective, but from the perspectives of those who need assistance? Fundamentally, alongside that, we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to change to enable that? So that's enough from me. And before I get started, it's a real pleasure to introduce now Ron Del Nervo, the Executive Director of Europe for the ATM Industry Association. So Ron is the new chair of the board for CALP. This is the first time that we're having somebody from the private sector as the chair of our board, so double pleasure there. Great to see our former chair, Nigel, sitting there, and also John, one of our board members, and I know we've got a couple of other board members that will also be attending this week. So with that, over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much. I didn't really need a mic.
They need it for the film.
Oh, you need it for filming, okay. The cameras must rule. Firstly, welcome to London. As a Scot, I can say welcome to warm and sunny London, because it's at least 5 degrees colder up there. It's a great pleasure to see so many people gathering here. It's a privilege to be the chair of the CALP board and to succeed somebody of the quality of Nigel Timmins, who, as Karen said, is sitting in the audience today because Nigel did a great job as the chair. So my job is just to say welcome, but also to comment on some of the issues that we face today. Clearly, we're in a world of dwindling resources, and we're challenged to find the right way to use those dwindling resources to help the recipients of humanitarian aid. And so we need the best solutions that give value and deliver something that I'm proud to say we're big on in my industry, payment choice to the recipients of aid. If you haven't got choice in life, you haven't got much of a life. So that's a very laudable thing to be aiming for. As far as CALP's concerned, clearly we're privileged to have as members many humanitarian agencies, local, worldwide, small and large. But equally now we have financial services organisations, we have various other players from the commercial world, and all of these organisations working together can provide the best solutions. And that's what we really should be interested in, if you like, networking of humanitarian aid. Put simply, let's all just work together to find the best solutions. Obviously, we've got pressing challenges today. I heard Karen say that people are saying that we have a digital future. We don't have a digital future, we have an analog and digital future. And if we're not careful, we don't get the future right, we're going to have a very wet future, as we all know, because global warming is something that we're all suffering from. So I don't believe in one solution. In the end, the beneficiaries of any technology have got to be the human race. And that's what I'm aiming for. So digital's brilliant, analog's brilliant. Let's find solutions that actually work. In terms of what we want from this week, this is your week. If you have a bad week, it's your fault. I don't believe in the blame culture. So don't have a bad week, have a very good week. If you travel in the London Underground, which I don't recommend if you want to have a comfortable life, you will hear people saying, if there's a problem, see it, say it, sort it. So that's what I'd urge you to do. If you have issues, if you see issues, don't sit quietly, and because Scots do that a bit. We sit and we don't speak very much, and we say, mustn't grumble. Grumble. Speak your mind and help us do a better job, because that's what I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with customer service. I believe we've got to deliver perfect customer service to enable the organisations that we work with to deliver perfect service to the people who are receiving humanitarian aid. So speak up, be open and honest, and contribute. And if you do that, you'll have a great week, and this will be a useful week for all of us. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm now handing over to Sophie and Ailid. I got that right? Yeah. And they're going to be talking about the future of financial assistance. So please give them a very warm welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ron and Karen, for that warm welcome. And I'm very pleased to be kicking off the first session of Cash Week. What does the future of financial assistance mean for my organisation? Just before we start, can the people in the back corner see us if we sit down? Or do you need us to wander around a bit? If at any point you can't hear us, see us, just stick your hand up and we'll do something about it. Great. So, welcome everybody. It is a real pleasure to look around the room and see so many of you who have contributed time, ideas, thoughts, comments, helpful criticisms to this report that we're launching today. It's been, as Karen mentioned, a year in the making and represents inputs from so many of you. So thank you so much for that. I'm Sophie Tolstrup, CALP's Policy Coordinator, and joining me for the first session today is Ailey Kennedy, who is the Deputy Director of the Interagency Regional Analysts Network, YARN, and the lead author of the report that we are launching today. I'm also joined by Meg Sattler, who is the Senior Programme Manager with Ground Truth Solutions, and we will be explaining her role in more detail in a few minutes' time. So I'm hugely excited that we're launching this report today. It's the culmination of more than a year's work and brain power by so many of you in this room today and across the network. And it was really inspired by lots of the ideas that came out of last year's Cash Week, as we'll explain in a second. Once Ailey and I have presented the key findings of the report, and you'll find the executive summary and some helpful infographics on your chairs, I'm looking forward to us taking the first steps together to unpack what this means for us as a network and for the people we serve. So, this is where I have to trust that the animations I did hastily this morning work. Why did we embark on this process? And the answer, as Karen said, is that the inspiration came from many of you. At last year's Cash Week, you told us clearly that delivering more cash implies and necessitates fundamental changes to the ways that we work, both within and between organisations, and that, therefore, as cash actors, we're driving and on the cutting edge of changes being discussed across the humanitarian system. Because cash doesn't fit neatly into a box, you're all having to innovate as you go and adapt to new challenges on the fly. So 2 events from last year to highlight in particular. At the NGO strategy session, which I realised this morning this is in fact not a picture of, but bear with me. At the NGO strategy session, you told us that while you see that you, as the cash specialists within your organisations, often see the need to work differently, making the case within your organisations for making those fundamental changes can be really challenging. You told us your organisations are very focused on the right now issues, and that underscoring the urgency of adapting to changing challenges and future opportunities was difficult. As we deliver more cash, you told us, we need to grapple with 3 things in particular. Firstly, cash looks a lot like and interacts with a number of other financial flows. An ODI study published, I think, last week that many of you will have seen estimates that only 1% of resource flows in countries affected by humanitarian crisis come from humanitarian aid. So we need to see ourselves in that light as a small piece of a much bigger puzzle and understand what role humanitarian cash should be playing for recipients. The second thing you told us is that delivering more cash should logically imply, a shift in power and agency from us as humanitarian actors to the recipients of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian actors, you told us last year, should increasingly move from being the deciders and the providers to being facilitators of individuals' and communities' own recovery. But this means making some big and sometimes painful changes to who we are and what we do. And thirdly, you told us that the role of technology in the delivery of cash, from the use of mobile money to working with financial service providers to blockchain, means that we have to very quickly get to grips with a new set of skills and relationships. This provides a huge opportunity, but also brings huge risk and many unknowns. We're currently playing catch-up, and you told us we need to quickly put some thinking behind this. The second event to highlight, and this is the right picture, is at the brilliant Future of Cash panel, and I would echo what Karen said. Please do go back and watch at least the highlights reel. It's only 2 minutes long. Panelists told us that cash actors are already on the cutting edge of change in the humanitarian system. If we're going to get practical about changing the ways we work as a humanitarian system, the CALP network, cash actors, are the place to start because we're already doing it. 3 things to highlight from the panel. The panel told us, first of all, that the world is changing fast. New needs, new contexts, and new actors. And yet, the pace of change in our system, in the humanitarian system, is glacial. We need to look to the future to do better today. And all of the panelists underscored the fact that resistance is futile. Change will either be driven by us or will happen to us. And there's not much we can do about it, so adapting to the future is critical. Second, and I had a note here to give Paola some props for this stirring speech, but she's not in the room, so we can do that tomorrow. We need to ensure the changes to the ways that we work are driven not by our desire as humanitarian actors to remain relevant or by how we'd prefer to work, but by what is actually needed, what recipients value and prefer. And we need to recognise as part of this that humanitarian actors won't and shouldn't be doing everything. We'll need to work with and alongside others as part of a marketplace of options available to crisis-affected people. Thirdly, again, this panel underscored that the digitalisation of aid provides a huge opportunity and also poses significant risks, which we urgently need to understand. So based on all of this, we kicked off the process of looking at the future of financial assistance and what it means. we've embarked on a process to support members to understand what's possible and what that means for opportunities to work and plan differently today. We want to support a process across the network of positive and people-centered change. And this starts with the report that we're launching today. Understanding what the future of financial assistance might look like and what the implications of different scenarios are for crisis-affected people and for humanitarian actors. Based on the findings and recommendations of this report, we're looking to kick off stages 2 and 3 of this process today, understanding what these possible futures mean for the people we serve, what they mean for how we're planning and delivering now, where we want to go and how we'll get there. So, the run of show for today. First of all, Ailey, the lead author of the report, is going to take us through the content of the report and its key findings. Then, apologies for not introducing you properly earlier, Meg Sattler from Ground Truth Solutions will then lead us through a session on flipping the perspective, how to think about change in the ways that we work from the recipient perspective. And then we'll take a short break, and then Ailey, Meg, and Jenny Caswell from GSMA will lead us through group work in understanding what each of the recommendations of the report implies in terms of changes to the ways we work and the opportunities and challenges to getting there. So, without further ado, and to officially launch this fantastic report, over to you, Ailey.
Before we get started on the report itself, Sophie asked me to talk a little bit about futures thinking. Both Karen and Ron and Sophie have all raised some of the issues that we face as humanitarian actors. And part of what we do at Yaren is to try and use futures thinking to help people really take some of the decisions that need to be made today in order to be better adapted and to deliver more effective aid in the future. And this takes us through a process. We think about futures in many different ways, but these 3 boxes offer us an interesting breakdown of it. The first is around strategic thinking. This is really where we try and provide all the experts who operate within this sector with the chance to really explore explore what they're working on. Think about trends, think about themes, think about challenges. Look at your intuition, synthesize this information, and be creative. This process of strategic thinking is really what has brought us to today with this report. This report is a compilation of inputs from so many different people who have been going through this process of reflection. And this then takes us to what we do with it. So as part of Futures, it's interesting work in and of itself, and if you have time to just sit and read it, it's an interesting report, I promise. However, the real point of writing it is to think about how we can use it. So this takes us onto processes of strategic development. How can we assess the options that it presents? How can we look at some of the challenges? And what are the choices that we have to make today in order to try and be more effective for the people that we serve? And this then opens us on to processes of strategic planning. This is where we consider, how do we implement some of these decisions? What are the different things we can do in order to make it happen, to achieve any vision that we set? So this is a very light overview of what we mean by futures thinking and how we try and use it in the humanitarian space. What we endeavor to do is to try and make real and concrete some of the different challenges that we face, and one of the main ones is uncertainty. How do we try and grapple with the fact that we don't necessarily know what the future holds? And going through processes of analysis, of discussion, of collaboration are really how we try and manage that. We get a grip on it. We're able to try and see and visualize what our future might be, and as a result, think through what the consequences of that would be for the way in which we work and the way we want to be structured. Jack Welch, who is CEO of General Electric, said, "When the rate of change outside an organization is greater than the rate of change inside, the end is near." This is a quote I really like, and I think it really behooves us as humanitarians to think about it very seriously. We've had some reflections of the discussions that happened last year, which talked a lot about the inertia that exists within the humanitarian system. We have made a lot of commitments that we have not been able to realize. Karen asked in her introduction if we're really serious. I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves every day, because I think we can assuredly say at the moment, the rate of change in the places that we work is extremely high. We operate in very dynamic environments, and I think it's fair to say that we're not keeping up. We're not able to really structure ourselves and our interventions, not only to meet the challenges, and we often focus on the negatives of where we're lacking and where there are gaps, but also to take advantage of some of the opportunities that are opening to work differently and more effectively. It's not just about how we mitigate what's going wrong, but also are we really leveraging what positive change there is in order to make some of our programs more sustainable, in order to transfer more power? Are we open-minded enough to be thinking about some of these things? And this is what a process of futures can do. It can encourage us to try and open our minds to think about these things. So on that, we can talk through the method that we used for this particular report. Essentially, we went through a process of morphological analysis, and you don't really need to know what that means, except to say that we build an architecture of a system. So we looked at the system of global cash, and we thought about what are the drivers that exist within it, who are the actors who play a main role in it, and we cast a very wide net at the beginning. Through literature reviews, through interviews, through workshops, we gathered a huge amount of information, and then through a process of what we call structural analysis, we broke that information down. So we started to try and group it by more influential actors, more influential drivers, thinking about how they interact with each other, until we ultimately came up with a list of 8 key drivers. These are the role of government, mobile technology and internet access, ID and its digitalization, data and data protection, population movements, the role of the private sector, funding levels for financial assistance, and use of financial services. Each of these 8 boxes contains a huge amount of information. And in the report itself, each of these 8 drivers are treated in what we call a driver file. It's a short section which essentially is a summary review of the research and information that we gathered on each of these topics. So if any of them are of particular interest to you, there exists in the report a short section that you can go and read on that. These 8 drivers make up what we call the foresight base. Essentially, this is where we do all of our research and we think through what are the different trends, uncertainties, changes, important factors to consider in each of these 8 sections. And then we go through a process of developing hypotheses. The reason we do this is because the future is an incredibly complex thing. Data says there are no facts about the future, which is very true. We don't know concretely what is going to happen tomorrow, and it's folly to try and pretend that we do. Rather, what we can do is use a process of analysis to build out our understanding of what the many possible futures are. Within each of these 8 different categories, there are a myriad of different evolutions that can happen. And the way we try and structure these are through hypotheses. So we create different hypotheses for each of these 8 drivers, and we then link those together in a set of scenarios. Scenarios themselves are just tools. They're ways of synthesizing all of this complex information into a digestible and a short and easy to grapple with sets of information. And in building these particular sets, we not only built them up from this research that was done through the process of structural analysis, but we also matched those with the scenarios that were written in the Future of Aid report. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that report. It was written a couple of years ago, and it looked and built out scenarios that examine what the future of aid will look like in 2030 and the future of INGOs. That was a much more global report, and we were able to draw on some of that research. But through this process, we were able to focus on what does the future of financial assistance mean within all of those broader changes. And that brought us to our 4 scenarios that exist within the future of financial assistance. We've termed these as control, chaos, emergence, and synergy. I will go through those all together in a couple of slides' time. But one of the things we also did, not only to develop these scenarios, but then through workshops and discussions to consider what the implications for these scenarios are, both for end users and for formal humanitarian actors. And that's a process that we want to continue to build on today. This piece of work is really intended to be the foundation of more thinking, of more discussion, and ultimately of action to really consider how we can try and change some of the processes within our own organizations, and critically, how we can build alliances and collaborate to try and change the system as a whole. And that's what we hope to use the outlook for the future of financial assistance for. I think now there should be a video on our drivers.
Drivers will significantly influence how financial assistance evolves over the next decade. These include the role of the private sector in the delivery of financial assistance via their tools and platforms and support to other actors. The role of governments of crisis-affected states in determining who provides financial assistance and how it's regulated. Mobile technology and internet access, which will continue to expand connectivity globally. ID and its digitization, which is often a requirement to access financial assistance, imposes challenges for people who cannot prove their identity. Data and data protection, with the increasing collection of personal data, including legal identity, demographic, family, socioeconomic, location, and contact information. The use of financial services and links to financial inclusion, and the issues this presents to those on the other side of the digital divide. Funding levels for financial assistance, alongside alternative funding streams such as person-to-person assistance, and population movement, which will impact the delivery of financial assistance due to the irregular status and vulnerability to exploitation of people on the move. Based on these drivers, the Future of Financial Assistance report outlines 4 potential scenarios for 2030. In the controlled scenario, governments lead financial assistance with a high degree of control over other actors and eligibility criteria. In the chaos scenario, end-user trust has been eroded by a lack of coordination and funding for a comprehensive response based on needs and standards. In the emergence scenario, new networks of humanitarian actors drive innovation in a deregulated environment. And in the synergy scenario, multiple interoperable modalities for financial assistance are coordinated under an umbrella of common principles and standards. These scenarios can be used to inform strategic planning to ensure that we can continue to meet the needs of crisis-affected people in a way that maximizes the impact of limited humanitarian resources.
Well, I think we have to thank Calp for that incredibly succinct summary video, or at least I do. It does a lot of my job for me. Rather than talking through each of the individual drivers themselves, as I said, that's done in detail in the report, I wanted to briefly just talk through some of the main points and themes that emerge from the analysis within all 8 of them. The reason that we structured part of our analysis in this way is that it's really fundamentally important to understand that none of these 8 drivers exist in a vacuum. They all interact with each other, and the change within one spurs change within another. And so the way in which we were thinking about some of this analysis when it came to writing the report really clustered some of these discussions around 4 themes. One was, who will be involved in the delivery of financial assistance? Who will the end users be, and what will their rights be over their data? What will the instruments of financial assistance be, and on what will they rely? And how will financial assistance be funded in the future? Within each of these 4 questions, there is obviously a myriad of different outputs and key information, but to just draw on some of them, I think Ron mentioned already this morning the need to consider all of the different actors who exist within this space, both government and the private sector. And this is fundamentally important. Governments are the largest provider of financial assistance in most places, and they touch on pretty much the way all financial assistance is delivered through regulation and through their control of the territories over which they govern. The private sector similarly is involved in nearly all phases of financial assistance, both from delivering it on various platforms, but also to support other actors within the system on the back end. The increased use of financial assistance has the potential to give more control to people affected by crisis so they can manage their own recovery, but it also opens up new vulnerabilities that must be considered, particularly over concerns about data and what is being done with it. However, there is a risk that we run headlong into a digital future whereby financial assistance is being increasingly digital, but this in and of itself can be quite exclusionary for those on the other side of the digital divide. And this is something that as humanitarians we really must consider as quite an important priority for us. Equally, because financial assistance often relies, or digital financial assistance often relies on the exchange of data for support the questions for some of these vulnerable communities and protections are something that we as a collective must start to be better aware of. I think Ron mentioned that the future is both digital and analog, and it reminds me of a conversation we had when preparing for this call, or for this panel, and someone said, you know, that sometimes we're at meetings and people spend the entire time talking about the future of blockchain without really remembering what our present is and what some of our more immediate challenges are. And I think while it's absolutely necessary for us to use these processes of futures thinking to consider what the potential is and what the opportunities are so we can be prepared for them, we also have to be realistic about where we're starting from today. I was at one of these meetings and someone mentioned what an excellent drinking game would be if every time someone said blockchain, you all had to do a shot, because it was just such a prolific thing that people were mentioning all the time without really thinking about how do we action that on a wide scale today, when so many organizations still don't have a lot of their data in Excel, let alone building up to a more digitized platform. So that's just a word of caution that we look at in some of these spaces, is it's not only about what's coming in 2030 and beyond, but also, you know, what does it mean for the steps that we need to take between now and there, and being quite aware of where the gaps exist and lie within that. Growing connectivity and financial inclusion can provide brand new avenues for people to manage their own response. And one of the things that really came out through the work that we do and the discussions that we were having is the fact that, as Sophie said, the percentage of financial assistance that's given through the humanitarian channels is quite small. People always complement this kind of assistance by drawing on their own networks, by using their own capacities, their own skills. And the fact that we don't acknowledge this and often don't look at what that capacity is and where those skills exist means that we are not always able to best complement those and to best provide a system whereby people who know what they have and what they need are able to actually get that. However, one of the things that also came up and was very clear in this is that CVA Cash provides a real opportunity for the whole humanitarian system. And the diversification of the funding for financial assistance is really key in this, and it's something that we can look at as actors to really consider how will that change the way we work, and how can we really try and embrace this as a way not only to provide more effective aid to the people who are affected by crises, but also to really try and ensure that it's fitting within their own response rather than just being a more convenient or more effective way of working for us as actors ourselves. On that note, I'd like to move to focus a bit more on our scenarios. I'm going to run us through these briefly. You have sort of summary sheets in front of you as well. But I would also like to stress that one of the things that we really focus on when we think about scenarios are the fact that they're a tool. They're intended to try and help us think more systematically and take a long-term view of the work that we're doing. But it also is, they are not necessarily, we are not choosing one future out of these four. All four of these futures can coexist. They can coexist in different places in the world. They can sometimes coexist within one country. Some of these futures already exist today in some places, and in some places we're far from any one of these images. The idea of these is not for us to take a bet on one. It's not for us to say that this one is the most likely and this is what we're going for and we're going to ignore the rest. The idea of creating four scenarios is really to think about the future in a plural way. We're not trying to guess what the future holds. We're trying to be able to consider all of the potential opportunities that it considers. So each of these four scenarios is designed to present to you a potential image of a future and challenge you to think about what that would mean for your organization, what that would mean for the end users of financial assistance. So you don't have to pick one or pick a favorite at any point in this. The first one that we looked at was the control scenario. This one really focuses on how government-led financial assistance can not only improve access in many places and ensure that the provision of financial assistance is being done by actors whom end users trust and it's more sustainable and stable. But it also looks at the potential flip side of that, whereby the provision of government financial assistance is something which can not only provide access to more people, but it can also exclude certain groups depending on the political and economic context of where we're talking about. In countries where the financial resources exist, this means that it would be a more sustainable system. However, in places where it does not, the limited role of international actors within this scenario means that there could be huge gaps emerging within this frame. The way in which governments restrict external assistance in some contexts in a much more political future means that it can be very difficult for international humanitarian actors to operate in some of these spaces. It can be hard to reach marginalized populations, but equally it can necessitate us as a humanitarian community to consider what our red lines would be in working through some of these government structures and with some of these government operatives. The expansion of government-led social transfers means that the platforms that are being used can be more reliable. There are financial services, internet and data, all of which is highly regulated. And within this context, because government control is so strong, there are likely to be more national entities and even multinationals who have more niche expertise or technologies who operate within that country are likely to do so under quite stringent regulations. The high level of oversight and control over ID and personal data and the coordination of single accounts means that though it can ease the system and the process of it, there's very limited user control over personal data. There is an opportunity within this scenario for the formal humanitarian sector to become a technical expertise for governments who are operating within this space, to share and pass on some of our experience and knowledge to ensure that government-led systems are operating at the most effective level. None of these scenarios are either a positive or a negative. They each contain positive and negative aspects, and that's another thing to bear in mind. As we were going through this process, someone kept raising the fact that they didn't think that some of these scenarios were reflecting the capacities of the governments of crisis-affected states. And that's something that we've really worked to address because it certainly wasn't reflected in the research that was done. It is absolutely true that governments in crisis-affected states have a pivotal and a lead role in the delivery of financial assistance in almost everywhere we work. And so while high levels of government control can come with certain costs, it also comes with huge benefits, and that's something that we as a sector have to bear in mind, even if it means a reduction in our own operating space. The next scenario that we look at, we've termed chaos. That's because in this scenario, it really looks at how it focuses on one of the main dynamics in our drivers, which is population movement. This is something that was brought up also in the introduction where Ron mentioned climate change, the growth in climate refugees, in displacement is something that is really, it is really a future challenge that humanitarians have to learn to grapple with. And financial assistance can be a particularly useful tool when doing so, which is why it was an area of focus in the report itself. In this scenario, we look at a system that is overwhelmed by the needs that exist. User trust is eroded by a lack of coordination and lack of funding for a comprehensive response based on needs and standards. What this means is that there are significant gaps in the provision of financial assistance, not only by governments in crisis-affected states, but also because governments are overwhelmed by the number of people entering their countries. And the migration and displacement means that governments attempt to be as restrictive as possible for who is eligible for national financial assistance streams, leaving gaps that exist within each of these contexts. Formal and humanitarian and development assistance are deregulated and unpredictable. In this scenario, we're looking at what it would look like if there was a real lack of global governance around some of these questions. There's an increased national responses in some places, but there's a real lack of transnational coordination, which means that the provision of services is extremely patchy, which is part of what builds towards this erosion of end user trust. The nature of transnational crises raises some significant issues in terms of interoperability of some systems and the way in which actors are able to operate across these different environments. And the unpredictability of the assistance provision means that it is incredibly difficult for end users to have any form of continual and reliable support across either a journey or in different phases of their displacement or need. The digital divide compounds divergence because in this scenario there is limited investment in infrastructure, which means that there is not the increasing access that we necessarily see in other scenarios. And that digital divide is not only between some groups who are moving and people who are being displaced, but also exists within countries where the expansion of the infrastructure on which some levels of financial assistance rely is not being done. The complexity of these crises leads to multiple different systems, not only different systems that deliver financial assistance, but also that link to your identity, which makes life incredibly complicated for ultimately for end users to try and grapple with. Within this scenario, there are a couple of key implications for us as humanitarian actors. Firstly, there is a need for collective engagement. With the withdrawal of global governments, we as international actors, maybe some of the ones who have more oversight over transnational phenomena, and our obligation to try and meet the needs of people, irrespective of where they are or where they're going, will be a real challenge. However, it's also an opportunity to try and use some new technologies, to try and use some of the new opportunities that could arise from some of the trends that we've looked at in terms of urbanization, education, and technological development to try and meet some of these challenges. However, it's also because of a fragmented system and a lack of regulation, a lack of transnational regulation really, it's incredibly hard to secure data, and it comes at a very high cost for all actors to try and ensure that the data that's being gathered about some of the people who are using financial services is actually being used responsibly by actors who are gathering it and is being held securely. Our third scenario is a scenario called emergence. In this scenario, we really look at how new networks of actors could operate and could be part of delivering financial assistance. In this scenario, it's one of the more interesting ones that we explore, because rather than looking at how there could be a resurgence or a regrowth in traditional forms of collaborative structures or global governance, we look at what more localized structures might take the shape of. In this frame, we really consider how the private sector, how local government, how local actors can form their own networks and leverage each other's expertise and experience, and through collaboration deliver financial assistance in new ways. These localized networks are able to create different systems which are best adapted to where they operate. However, while this provides huge opportunity in many contexts and in many places where we work, areas that have limited strategic interest or limited economic interest are often neglected, which means that there are significant gaps that exist within this scenario. It's not just that that protracted and forgotten crises will exist and ultimately will continue to exist, but also because of the way funding is explored within this scenario, it means that funding for those types of crises will decrease, because funding for other types of these new networks are more sustainably generated, tapping local networks and regional money that comes through. The digital divide within this grows, not necessarily within each country, but as I said, between this sort of dichotomy that's built between areas that are of strategic interest and economic importance, where local actors can really take a strong role to build a sustainable network, versus places where either the capacity or the interest internationally is just not there in order to support the development of that kind of frame. There are no common principles or standards, which means that actors operating internationally will have to be able to operate in multiple different types of regulations, in multiple different types of formats. This means that it will really challenge international actors to be adaptable, because in order to be effective, to fit in with these new networks, we'll have to be able to change the way we work according to what is functioning best within that microcosm. ID management and the collection of personal data are fragmented, again, similarly to the last scenario that we looked at. this level of fragmentation can generate real vulnerabilities because the levels of protection for people's data is very different. The ways in which organizations try and manage data will be different across different areas, which will be an incredibly complex thing for any larger organization to manage. There is the use of blockchain as prevalent, but interoperability is challenging. Again, because of a more fragmented system, there is no focus on trying to ensure that systems are interoperable, both between countries and different ways, because of the way they're generated more organically. Again, there are pluses and minuses to this. The plus is that this scenario looks at how more sustainable networks can be delivering financial assistance by tapping the expertise of different interested parties within a given space. However, that means that the interoperability of any of these systems is not necessarily a priority, and the gaps that exist in areas where there aren't these systems grow. For traditional humanitarian actors, the fragmentation is a real challenge, but it gives us the opportunity to work with new actors who are implicated within this space. Accessing different areas becomes more challenging, particularly because funding for some of these forgotten crises decreases, and the varied norms and practices are something that we will need to try and learn to be more adaptable to engage with and manage. Our final scenario is called synergy. This one looks at how multiple interoperable modalities for financial assistance are coordinated under an umbrella of common principles and standards. I know I said that all scenarios have their pluses and minuses, but this is often the scenario that has the most pluses, so it's the most fun to end on. This one is really more of a visionary scenario. It looks at how a system that could be developed whereby all actors are able to leverage their expertise to achieve a common goal. Governments that provide social transfers work closely with both civil society and the private sector to be able to deliver those services. This really reflects the fact that the role of governments is and should continue to be a very strong one, but it posits a future whereby the actors who exist around that government intervention are able to best complement those types of interventions. External financial assistance and private sector engagement are actively encouraged. This offers a huge opportunity for different types of technologies and innovation to really penetrate the space more effectively. And this is something that I think we can all accept we struggle with today. As I said, we talk a lot about the technology that's coming and the opportunity that that provides, and that's a good thing because we should keep our eyes on the future, not only because of the opportunities and the vulnerabilities that are there, but because I think it also can give us a drive to acknowledge the fact that there are technologies today that we are not using as effectively as we should be. So these types of discussions can hopefully provoke us to think that way, and I think this scenario, which posits a future whereby we're able to really try and streamline some of these developments into the way we're working and channel some of these advances to deliver better financial assistance for people in need is incredibly important. The different entry points for supporting the government exist, and the diverse funding sources for financial assistance are something that means that the system itself is able to grow. The way in which regulation is developed within this scenario is more organic in the sense that rather than being necessarily state-focused, other actors, such as humanitarian actors, are able to put forward standards and guidelines which really try and underpin the way in which we're working at a global level. Similarly, this affects global ID standards and the way in which we're using some of these new technologies, including around the protection of data. The synergy scenario offers a couple of different implications for us as global humanitarian actors. Firstly, I think there's a real opportunity for global leadership. It is a scenario that sets up not only state actors to be defining what the laws and regulations are around the kind of future that we're looking at, but it opens the space for both private sector and humanitarian actors to take on that mantle. And it's something that I think we as a community should strongly consider. It also gives us the opportunity to think about how we can improve service delivery and maximize the potential of some of the trends and opportunities that we are seeing coming down the pipeline. And it challenges us to see ourselves as operating within this broader spectrum, but not just in a way where we are either plugging gaps or trying to fill in different spots, but actually being proactive in the definition of what this space means. All four of these scenarios are explored in much more detail in the report. And For the rest of today, we don't necessarily need you to have read them all or to have studied them, but their intention is really to just try and provoke some thought from you. To really think about, what would your organization look like? What would you like it to be able to do in any of these scenarios? What do you think the value added is of financial assistance, of the way we're working in each of these different futures? So we'd encourage you to try and use them in that way. Really try and engage with them as a tool rather than something that's being put in front of you as a static document. Finally, I just want to talk through briefly some of the key takeaways that we had in the report. The first one is financial assistance is more effective and sustainable as part of a complementary set of interventions. I don't think this is news to anyone, but I think it really, as Karen, go back to the question Karen asked us, are we really serious? There are, I think, because this isn't news to anyone, it challenges us to think why we are not currently able to and why we have not been bettered to this point now at thinking about ourselves as being part of a much broader system of financial assistance. There's a lot of hubris within the humanitarian community where when we gather and when we sit and we talk about some of these challenges, we often discuss it as though we operate in a vacuum. Like we are the people who are here with the solution, and these are what the challenges are, and we're going to answer all of them, and this is our role as humanitarian actors. And really, that doesn't reflect the reality in the places that we work. We are a part of a much bigger system which centers around people who are affected by crises, and they themselves have huge amounts of capacities and skills which we don't often take into consideration when we're making decisions on their behalf. And this is something that is highly problematic, but it's also something that we can use, hopefully, financial assistance to try and challenge. And that takes me on to our second key takeaway. There's considerable space for end users to increase their influence, but organizations are often poorly incentivized to update their business models to shift more power to crisis-affected people. Financial assistance within the humanitarian space also doesn't operate in a vacuum. The way in which financial assistance will develop is impacted by the power imbalances, by the relationships, and by the dynamics that define how we operate within the humanitarian system as a whole. However, financial assistance can be a transformative entry point to tackling some of this inertia. I genuinely believe this is a really important point for us to consider. Some of the changes that will be made over the coming decades will be considered painful for many organizations because often it's about giving up power, giving up control, giving up market share, giving up the way we talk about these things as though we are businesses that are expected to continually increase our financial turnover and expand where we're operating and working. We have to try and change the way we think about success, to think about not our own growth, but about the impact that's being delivered and the way in which we're able to really try and focus on the way in which end users are developing rather than our organizations are being built. I say this at almost every presentation I give, but I also have to acknowledge the difficulty in doing that because the incentive structure under which humanitarians operate really is not set up to do that, which means that it's a huge challenge for organizations to try and make that shift. And the only way we can do it is by thinking more optimistically and positively. And I think CVA and financial transfers can provide us with a way of seeing how it is transferring more power, of giving more dignity to end users. And it's a way that is already concrete today. And so we can hopefully use that as a way to try and not only increase the amount of financial assistance that's being given, but to tackle some of these broader inertias within our system. Finally, financial assistance will be central to what humanitarian aid and social assistance look like in 2030. And it's up to humanitarian actors to decide if they will seize these opportunities presented in the highly dynamic space. Choice is an incredibly important part of what we're talking about here. And Ron mentioned it as being fundamental, and I think it absolutely is. Ultimately, it's a question of changing the way in which we think about our work and trying to be optimistic about a future in which we have a reduced role. Now, that's a change in mindset and it's a change in worldview, which is what is most challenging, and often that's the biggest stumbling block to trying to move in that direction. But I think within this room, because we are focusing on cash and financial assistance, you guys can be the drivers of some of these conversations because you have positive stories to say about the way in which cash can be used to try and drive some of these things. I'll now pass it over to Sophie to talk about the recommendations in the report. But I would strongly encourage you to read it. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me afterwards. I'd be delighted to discuss it.
Thank you so much, Ailey. That was a masterful summary of an incredibly rich report. And I would encourage you all to take a look at it. And what was very exciting as you were going through that is looking around the room and remembering all of the inputs into all of these scenarios that we've had from so many of you here today. So thank you. This has been a real collaborative effort, and we're really pleased with where we've got to. If I could just steal the clicker from you. Thank you. So I realise we've thrown a lot of information at you, and I'm going to run very quickly through the recommendations from the report before handing over to Meg. 2 reasons to continue to give your attention to the recommendations are that there will be a Twitter poll run over the coffee break on these various recommendations to see where you're what's worrying you the most. And second of all, that the group work this afternoon will ask you to pick 2 of these recommendations to dive into in more detail. So, I think I failed to animate this slide, so apologies for all the text. Okay, here we go. So what we tried to do is what we'll do today is to try and think about the implications of this report for all of us in the room and for what they mean for crisis-affected people. But we just try to get the ball rolling on this by adding to the report some recommendations which, although the implications are different under every scenario, these are some broad recommendations that fall under, that kind of fall out of all the scenarios. So under any scenario, these seem to be important for us to think about in our work. They're purposefully very broad, and we will get into much more detail on them today. But I just want to run through the headlines, at least for now. So the first one is, as we've mentioned quite extensively and as Ailey touched upon, the need to treat cash and voucher assistance as part of a much broader landscape of financial flows. We keep referencing this ODI study because it's brilliant. It shows very clearly that humanitarian assistance represents, in many cases, not in every context, a tiny piece of the overall picture. People in crisis may have access to remittances, access to social transfers, access to peer-to-peer giving, and, as the ODI report very powerfully states, assistance from their own communities, which is a huge part of the response. And to be fit for the future, we need to work better with and alongside these other flows, understanding what the indispensable added value of humanitarian cash assistance is and where it can and must focus. The second recommendation is, of course, and Meg will be adding to this in detail in a couple of minutes, putting the needs and voices of users at the centre. This is something we need to do under any scenario, and however we look at humanitarian assistance, but it really comes out strongly in futures where financial assistance is a bigger piece of the puzzle. Financial assistance should logically increase the power and agency of its recipients. People have more choice, people have more control, less decisions are being taken by international actors on their behalf. But the research, as we'll hear in a second, shows that more cash has not, in fact, equated to this shift in the power balance. Recipients in general don't feel listened to, don't feel that financial assistance responds to and is delivered according to their needs and preferences. So as we work more closely with these other types of financial flows, greater accountability is needed. Under any of these scenarios, in any future at all, we need to urgently explore what we can do now to increase accountability, ensure programs are designed and evaluated based on user experience, and start to shift the power and resources from humanitarian actors to the users of financial assistance. The third one is evaluating collective impact and using this to drive our programming decisions. So one of the blind spots that we identified during the preparation of this report was that we simply don't know what the collective impact of what we're delivering is, not even among humanitarian actors in a response, let alone between the different financial flows that exist in crisis contexts. So we're not doing a good job at learning what works, which interventions and which combinations of interventions drive change, and we're not therefore able to scale it. Getting better at this will mean starting at home, will mean taking a much more transparent and much more collective approach to M&E, treating evaluation data as a public good which should drive overall learning and improvement, and not as a project or organisation-specific PR exercise. Fourth, taking data responsibility seriously. This is an area that we'll dive into later in the week in a lot more detail. But under all of these futures, systems for delivering financial assistance are digitising faster than our legal and ethical frameworks can keep up with. All of the scenarios point to the need to quickly get to grips with what doing no digital harm looks like, and the threats and challenges, as well as the opportunities that come with the digitisation of aid. We need to step up our efforts in managing data securely and work on how we enable data sharing for individual and collective good. Number 5, as Ailey's covered in some detail, we need to prepare to better meet the needs of people on the move. Under any scenario, we are looking at a huge increase in population movements, both within and across borders, including through irregular channels. Estimates vary, and you all will have seen that there is some very frightening estimates out there, but include projections, and the projection that we've used for the report is more than 143 million additional climate migrants by 2050. We're already struggling to deliver financial assistance, any assistance, to people on the move, and improving upon this and learning how to reach and serve people on the move is an urgent priority. And number 6 is maintaining the trust relationship. So the ICRC published a great paper last week on how the trust relationship is right at the centre of effective humanitarian action. We cannot deliver humanitarian assistance effectively unless the trust relationship exists. And all of these scenarios involve working differently with a broader range of actors and mediating the relationship that we have to some extent with recipients of humanitarian assistance. In increasingly politicised environments and working more closely with non-humanitarian actors, what can humanitarian actors do to safeguard the trust relationship and ensure that users are treated with respect, receive quality services, and are protected? We need to consider what these different scenarios mean for the humanitarian principles and their application, and how humanitarian actors can work with others to protect this. So, we'll be taking a closer look at these for the rest of the day. We'll be asking you to pick 2 and understanding together what they mean and what is missing. I'm going to push the questions to after Meg's presentation, if that's all right, so you have the full picture. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to Meg from Ground Truth Solutions. Before we look at the implications of these scenarios for humanitarian actors planning, she's going to help us think through what planning from the recipient perspective looks like. What do we know about what the recipients of financial assistance need and value, and how can we embark on strategic planning from this perspective? So Meg, I'm going to ask you guys to switch, if that's all right. Switching. Cool.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and to Kelp for having me. I would say inviting me, but you didn't invite me. You invited my colleague Louisa, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. So I will do my absolute best to do a good job. I am not a cash person. I'm a long-suffering accountability person. And because of that, I am going to, we've just been framed by an amazing presentation of future planning and very exciting big picture thinking. I'm going to probably do my best to take us back to basics a little bit, just to get us back to what does it mean to be rooted in a people-centered approach to cash, and what does that mean for accountability? As this is not an accountability conference where I don't know everyone, and it's not just a lot of people who know everyone else talking about accountability in the absence of anyone who can actually do anything based upon our recommendations, this is a really good opportunity for me to be able to say accountability to affected populations is not some mystical programmatic area, and I think that we've really, as an accountability person, I can admit this, done ourselves a disservice by making it one. And so while I've put the IASC definition of accountability there, I've also just put the English definition, and I think it's really useful for us as practitioners of cash to say, how can we be responsible for what we're doing and be able to give a satisfactory reason for it, or the degree to which this happens, to the people that we're working with. as Ground Truth Solutions, we often get called an accountability agency, but we're not accountability. We support accountability from other actors. When I was asked to give this presentation, I was very excited about it because Sophie and I have had a long-standing conversation where we said, let's write a paper, and the paper is going to be about this wedding of accountability and cash and voucher assistance, and that will absolutely reform the humanitarian system. We have that in a Google Doc, and we will at some point finish it, but because we will finish it soon. That's been about a year, I think, in the making. So spoiler alert, basically what we're saying is that if this happened, we think that aid would be better. The reason that I think that that's true is that we have been great friends for a long time, and we have this intention to work together, and we're doing a lot of planning towards better aid, but we're doing it in parallel. I think it's worth celebrating some reforms that have happened in parallel in both accountability and cash. One obvious one is the grand bargain. Donor reforms, I don't know whether there's anyone from DFID in the room, but DFID payment by results has been a great champion of both cash assistance and accountability. The new humanitarian program cycle templates have very much tried to scale up both cash assistance and accountability. The new terms of reference for humanitarian country teams and intercluster coordinators groups also include now a sort of stepped up version of both cash and accountability. We both occupy a lot of airtime in the humanitarian innovation discussion, and we both have huge opportunities with private sector and tech. But I would say, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but we have definitely lost an opportunity. And I think we lost it because we took all these great efforts and momentum and we focused it on ourselves. And so we started to count progress towards both cash and accountability in terms of our own reforms, our frameworks, our agreements. And in doing that, we did that because it's easier to quantify, right? Like we can say we have a framework and we have more cash, and that is something we can measure. We have a framework and we have accountability mechanisms, and we can measure how many countries in which we have an accountability mechanism. But that means that we have diverted attention away from what people are telling us and also from outcomes. And so I think these two areas that are meant to really disrupt the humanitarian sector, we should always be checking ourselves, are our indicators more engagement or better engagement? Is it more cash or better cash? I will tell you that Ground Truth has done a lot of surveys and we get a lot of answers. We have never had anyone tell us that they were super excited to hear about a new framework that happened in Geneva, or that there was a new... That's just not the sort of stuff that people care about in the field. There's also some ethical questions to think about. Both accountability and cash reforms at the global level cost money. I mean, to do a Ground Truth survey costs quite a lot of money. To have an event like this definitely costs a lot of money. And we need to think about anything that we're doing to create impact in the field. How are we actually going to measure that and ensure that that happens? There's also this constant rhetoric that cash equals dignity, and that might be true to an extent, but you know, we're delivering cash, we're not working at, you know, Bob's Dignity Shack. And so I think that on the one hand, I don't know where that came from. While we can be claiming to be distributing dignity, we also need to be listening to what people are telling us. And I think we need to have a very clear understanding that dignity is an outcome and an end state and not something that we can provide. A lot of the feedback that we get as Ground Truth actually tells us that a lot of indicators that you might use to equate to dignity, people definitely don't feel that they have those in their lives. And so I think it's very important for us to think about and ask people, what does a dignified life entail, and what are we doing to be able to achieve that state? This is just to reiterate again that in the accountability space, we have made quite a few gains, but they've mostly been on the policy side, the mechanism side, and the funding side, which is great. But the areas that we have for improvement are definitely on this outcomes, on mainstreaming, so accountability doesn't continue to be siloed, but actually becomes everyone's job, and also incentives for and accountability for accountability. Is everyone here familiar with ground truth solutions? I won't spend too much time on this then. I've recently joined Ground Truth and I'm very excited about it, so I like to talk about it. But what we do as an agency is we collect perceptions, points of view and priorities of people who receive aid, both cash and other forms of aid. We then analyse and discuss those findings with humanitarian actors and then do joint action planning on identifying things that we can improve, and then we close the loop. Increasingly, what we're trying to get away from is closing the loop just with the findings, because we have had actual examples where we do that and people say, well, we know that because we told you that. So what have you actually done to address these issues? What we don't do is a needs assessment. The reason for that is that needs assessment data obviously exists. There are organisations like REACH that do this very well. We, as Ground Truth, don't want to understand what people need, but we want to understand the how and why and how people experience aid to be able to make sure that it is as effective as possible. This is the cycle in which we work. So we have a design phase where we co-design our either survey or user-centered methodology with humanitarian actors, collect information from people by asking them a series of perceptual questions, analyse the data, have a dialogue phase, which is arguably actually our most important phase because that's where the changes are made, and then hopefully course correct and then do it again. So we try to go back to people and ask questions a number of times so that we're able to track whether or not things are improving. This is just a quick summary in terms of why we think perceptions are important. It shows people that we're listening to them. It's quite a simple methodology, but it's quite sound in terms of being able to see how a response is perceived and therefore how much people trust it. It helps us to understand the needs of people affected by crisis, gives us better ideas on how to support them, and also it inspires action. So we're able to then show changes that are made in the lives of affected people. Last year at Cash Week, we presented our user journeys work, so I'm not actually going to go into that again today in great detail, but I just wanted to show you that. If you haven't seen this and you're interested in it, it's on our website, so please do have a look. Essentially, it was a process of using design thinking to track someone's whole experience of a cash program, and that is now being used to inform a lot of subsequent cash programs. We also now have this project, the Cash Barometer, which is based upon a mixed methods approach to see how cash is going across a response. We hear from aid recipients by and large that they prefer cash, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. But essentially we want to make sure that as well as just tracking how many people are getting cash, that we're seeing what their experiences of cash are. Sorry, I'm rushing through a bit because I have too many slides. So this is what people have been telling us about cash. We have just produced a cash brief, which if you don't have it, you can get it from the front of the room on the registration desk. We track perceptions in a number of ways. We track cash programs specifically. We also track response-wide, working with humanitarian coordination teams to get kind of a pulse check on a response. And we work with individual agencies. So we've just gone through a process of trawling through all of these findings and picking out some of the emerging trends in cash. You'll all be very pleased to know that people are telling us that cash is better. That is confirmed. You're all doing a great job. The problem with this is that so often the conversation stops there. So we say cash is better, so let's get more cash. I mean, I want more cash, you probably want cash. I don't think that we probably needed to do enough surveys to work this out. But we do need to find out more about what that means for people's lives. Again, the more cash, the better. This is actually more interesting than it may immediately look, and I'll go into some findings in a moment about how people see cash in emergencies, not just in terms of their emergency needs as a way to replace kind of food or physical aid, but as something that actually helps them to plan for the future. The more flexible, the better. Again, I think is something that is very much in line with the rhetoric of the cash community. In Lebanon, Turkey, Kenya and Iraq, we found a strong preference for cash transfers over vouchers because this meant that they were able to determine how they used it. We have found, though, that money can't buy everything. So most people, even though they do have a preference for cash, say that they want to receive cash alongside other forms of aid. And the percentages for that differ, obviously, in every different place. And it can also change very much over time. So we might do a survey and then do it again in 3 months, and the findings on this are quite different, both in terms of the percentage of people who want cash versus other aid, but also what the other aid might be at a certain given time. And just to reiterate again, we have found that cash doesn't equal dignity. So a lot of people who are receiving cash don't necessarily equate that to them having this incredible experience of the humanitarian response. We have a standard question in our response-wide work where if people tell us that they don't feel that their needs are being met, and let's be honest, that is most people in a humanitarian response, cash overall is the number one response that they give in terms of what they think is their number one unmet need. And here it's come out at 20%. Country by country, obviously, it changes a little bit. Often it's much higher. I just got back from both Iraq and Somalia, and it was more at the kind of 50% mark. This is an example from Iraq. So here in Iraq, when we ask people if aid covers their most important needs, there's a lot of red there. That is not unusual. Most responses would have that sort of percentage. 54% said that their primary unmet need was cash. And this is what I was referencing before, which I personally think is quite interesting. So when we ask people, another standard question is whether aid would enable them to live without aid or services in the future. In Iraq, this is again quite a dire finding. I think people don't feel very hopeful about their prospects of, to promote self-reliance. But when we ask them what would enable them to live without aid in the future, a very obvious answer to that was a job or a salary, and that is something that you see across most countries. But funnily enough, in Iraq, 51% also said cash assistance. So they're looking at ways that they can manage their own finances and, you know, in terms of being able to live a more sustainable life. Cash is unfortunately not exempt from the accountability issues that plague the sector. Plague is a strong word, but they do. If you look at things like the Core Humanitarian Standard Accountability Report, every single year, findings on people's ability to access feedback mechanisms or to have the information that they need or to feel that they're involved in the response is really low. Every single peer-to-peer mission has found that accountability has not come out well in terms of humanitarian coordinators' progress and priorities. People tell us that information on cash programs is not provided in the right way and tends to only happen at the beginning of projects and not on an ongoing basis. And this lack of awareness leads to stress and desperation, particularly when transfers stop unexpectedly. I think most of you have seen this already, but it's quite a dire state of affairs. We ask people if they know how aid agencies decide who receives cash and who doesn't, and this again is a very, very negative response that people tend to give us. This is not something that's new, and I think that this comes up a lot, and there are obviously reasons for this, and it's quite difficult sometimes to work on targeting. I've been on the other side of this, so I know how hard it is. But I think it's just worth remembering this always, that we can't assume that because we've come up with some sort of process or criteria or we have funding constraints or whatever it is, that means that people necessarily understand that. Reach has recently done some research in Somalia and found that people's main barrier to accessing any form of aid was actually a lack of information, which is very interesting. But I have some positive news, so it's okay. While scores remain very low across the board on accountability, cash recipients we have found recently do tend to respond more positively on a number of indices. So cash recipients specifically tend to feel more informed about aid, they feel more aware of their rights, they feel better able to meet their basic needs, they're more convinced often that their opinions are considered, and they do tend to find lodging a complaint easier. And we've drawn these conclusions based upon an analysis of most of our response-wide surveys, drawing linkages between different answers across both. I will underscore, though, this bottom part, which is that while they're better, I'll show you in a minute what we mean by better, and it's still not great. So this is what I mean. So this was in Lebanon. Do aid providers take your opinion into account when providing aid? Cash recipients felt more positively about this, but marginally. And it's the same for, does the aid you receive currently cover your most important needs? Cash recipients say yes. A little bit more, maybe more so than the previous finding, than non-cash recipients. While this is not that positive, I think this is an important part for us to pause on, because I think that this demonstrates the opportunity that Sophie and I were talking about when we were talking about creating this paper and working together more, is that if we do now see that there is this direct correlation but the findings are still bad, I think it's really worth thinking maybe throughout the next year until next Cash Week, how can we really try to improve on these findings so that next time we do these surveys, and we will do these surveys, that the green is a little bit longer. And I think that it's actually quite an exciting opportunity for us. I'm just going to move on to this slide. This again is just a way to demonstrate that, AAP on its own is not the be-all end-all for quality programming, and neither is cash assistance, but we do have a theory that a combination of better quality assurance, AAP, cash and voucher assistance, and better coordination can actually start to really fast-track some of these humanitarian reform processes. This is a confusing graph, and also the bottom of it is cut off, but I'll explain what it means quickly. This is just to kind of reference the fact that cash-based programming doesn't get itself away from the kind of overall state of the art in humanitarian response, which is that accountability is still fairly bad. And I wanted to point to basically this heat graph. The darker numbers are the least positive. And so while we're in a situation now where people actually across the board, cash recipients and not, do feel that aid providers treat them with respect, they might feel welcomed in their communities, etc., that they definitely don't feel that aid providers basically ever take their opinions into account. And I think it's just something to remember when looking at any type of programming that we're designing. This is just something that I find interesting, and so I thought I would include it because PSEA is such a big topic at the moment. In our most recent round of surveys, so those are 2 surveys that have just taken place in Somalia and Iraq, we found a really interesting trend towards people feeling more able to report instances of abuse or mistreatment than able to provide complaints or feedback generally. And I think that we can probably draw some conclusions on this proliferation of focus on PSEA in responses, and think about, if that is something that's happening, how can we make sure that those same mechanisms are being used to basically improve accountability overall. And I think that this is a finding that has been mirrored now in the last 2 countries where we've done surveys. And so it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of cash-based assistance, PSEA, AAP. How can we kind of merge all of these things together a bit more? Obviously, this has been a large part of the previous presentation, but some questions that we're having at the moment as Ground Truth is, how do we continue to monitor affected people's perceptions of cash and voucher assistance if it's such perhaps a minimal part of their kind of overall lives? So looking at market-based programming, the future of financial assistance, social protection. And just to quickly go to the next slide, some things that we think we don't know enough about. And I think these are things that we don't often track very well in terms of perception surveys or feedback mechanisms, and something that over the next few days it would be really interesting to think about how to get more user experience information on these things. Cash programming and broad solutions, for example. So the example that I gave from Iraq. How much do we know about that in terms of the nexus and how much cash can play a role there? Our capacity to either relinquish or adapt our levels of control and what that means for aid recipients. How would we define or fit into a new humanitarian world order where there were no clusters, for example? I think cash is very much on the front foot of that, but what does that mean in terms of sectoral type cash programs? How do we keep listening to people in the future scenarios outlined in the report, which obviously we'll go into a bit after the break? And what does cash competition mean for accountability? We've just quickly gone through some of the scenarios presented in the report and thought about some key questions that would be useful for accountability. So in the control scenario, how much does accountability include advocacy and how much does advocacy include accountability? I think is quite an interesting question. In the chaos scenario, how do we understand and support community financial networks? In the emergent scenario, a lot of the same AAP issues might apply, and so how are emerging actors ensuring inclusion? And in the synergy scenario, much as the above, how do we keep systematically listening to people in this new situation, and to what extent do we want to let go? Ground Truth has quite a lot of interesting findings on localisation, and my colleague Ilias is actually about to release a blog about this. But often when we ask people in emergency situations who they trust either to receive aid or information from, surprisingly often it's international actors above local actors. And so what does that mean in terms of if we're listening to people but also letting go and focusing more on localisation, for example? I think there's a lot of discussion in these AAP type chats about user-centered design. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I've spoken a lot already, but this is just a picture that I've taken from LNAP. And I think it's just worth always referring back to pictures like this when we are designing our programming, because I think often what we think about in user-centered design is that we start somewhere in the green part and then we put it to users and see if they want to adapt to it or not. Whereas actually starting from the user-centric experience is something that I would say across the board we very, very rarely get right. There's also perhaps a tendency to assume that user-centered design is just done by asking enough questions at the start of a program. This is an example of this that I find really interesting from our user journeys, where we may think that because we're doing a very comprehensive needs assessment and we're asking a lot of questions and we're designing this program that very much took into account people's information, the questions that we're asking make no sense to these people. So this isn't a participatory, empowering program. This is asking questions about why someone eats meat and they have no idea why we're asking that question. And so I think we constantly need to be checking ourselves in terms of the sorts of engagement that we're doing and whether or not it is empowering. Just going back to my initial slide, I noticed that obviously 2 of the recommendations that Sophie outlined before were how do we maintain this trust relationship and how do we put the needs and voices of users at the centre. I maintain that this marriage is going to go a long way to doing that. But I think it's just a really important thing to focus on not only over the next 3 days, but also over the next year. As I said, Ground Truth is collecting this data all the time, so it's actually a really good way to provide a check and balance on whether some of these things are improving or not country by country. And hopefully when we are back next year, we'll be able to show lots more green on our graphs. So thank you very much. I look forward to a very fruitful marriage to all of you. And yeah, I'm around for the next few days. We have our cash brief, which is out in the front section. And do feel free to come to me or Louisa, whose email is there and is much more involved in the cash world than I am, if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meg. That was brilliant. And so we've looked far into the future and we've come back to the present to see what we're getting right and more importantly wrong from the recipient perspective. We've got a few bonus minutes, so we could maybe take 15 minutes of questions, comments, thoughts for any of the panel at this stage, and then we will move on to outlining the activities for the rest of the day. So any thoughts, comments or questions at this point? Rose has the roving mic.
Testing. Hi, thank you, Meg, Ailey and Sophie for setting the scene and giving us a lot of information, future, past, present, all together. My name's Jacqueline Fries and I have a question for Ailey perhaps. In your 4 future scenarios, in your analysis and in your data searching, do you have any figures on the actual government's financial service provider role, you know, the flows of finance that governments have done over years? I'm going to show my age here, but way back in the 90s when we were going through adjustment, structural adjustment with a human face, we were encouraging the liberal market and we were encouraging governments to stop pampering citizens. And I'm just wondering if you've got some global figures on those financial flows, how much the government has been given over the last few decades. That'd be really useful.
Brilliant. Thank you. We'll maybe just take a couple more, allow people to collect their thoughts. Any more comments or questions?
Really for you, Meg, you're saying that people didn't feel that, people didn't feel that they'd been given dignity in the main. What would be the highest score you could ever expect, though, when people are receiving aid of any kind? Because that's not a dignified position, is it? Because you're taking crudely handouts, and that's not necessarily going to make you feel good about yourself, is it? So what would be your view of what would be a good score, an acceptable score? It's not going to be 100% ever, is it?
Maybe we'll just take one more. Did I see a hand at the back? No? Seeing things.
Hi. I'm just curious how much thought has gone into the mechanism of cash itself in terms of, do communities need a medium of exchange or do they need cash? And what's the difference between those two things?
Right. Okay, thank you. Amy, do you want to tackle the government contribution question?
No. I think this is probably one of our biggest issues with doing this kind of research. Gathering figures is across something like financial assistance was incredibly difficult. Firstly, because everyone measures slightly different things, which means that data sets, we're not able to amalgamate data sets, which means that the utility of each one is really limited, because if everyone is measuring slightly different things, it means that you can't get an aggregate. I can definitely go back through our research and find you some figures. If you give me your contact details, I can share all of the information that we have. But even collecting information about sort of the more global humanitarian level, when we start unpicking those numbers, we find that a lot of those are even very difficult to take reliably. It is the evidence that we have demonstrates that the amount of spending by government on financial assistance is increasing, particularly since it has been increasingly promoted by the World Bank, by the IMF, and by others as ways of sort of increasing economic development by making these kinds of investments. So I think the mindset is changing somewhat around these, which is giving governments more space to spend more money. But in terms of a hard and fast figure for you, I don't have one now, but I will certainly look back at our research to get it. But I just wanted to caution you that it is, in being able to build an accurate picture, which is why, I think some of the questions we have, or one of the recommendations we have about evaluating collective impact, is incredibly important, because we ultimately just don't have that information, which is, it's difficult. For sure. I'll just talk a little bit about the mechanisms for cash itself. This was something we looked at mostly because I think it is so variable across different communities that you can't paint one picture. When we look at considerations about things like the digital divide, when we consider the way in which people are going to be spending that money and the markets to which they have access, it really does vary quite a lot. I think though it varies, I think one of the things we have been looking at in terms of the trends that are growing are that as connectivity increases, as the way in which people are able to sort of interact with different financial services, and that is becoming increasingly digital, the need for a sort of an intermediary mechanism declines. But for sure, that's very nascent to non-existent in some places, and in other places that's sort of a fully fledged system. One of the complications, I suppose, that I think we have as humanitarian actors is that we operate everywhere from Malaysia and Indonesia to the Central African Republic. And the context in terms of cash and technology and sort of infrastructure and platforms, it is just night and day. But I think part of our issue is that we don't adapt very well to the fact that there is that huge difference. So in response to your question, it runs the gauntlet, but what really challenges us, I think, is that we don't take enough advantage of some of these platforms where they do exist, and then which means that we're then missing vast opportunities because we sort of operate on more of a standard model, which is very problematic, as is demonstrated in a lot of these scenarios in research. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Meg, do you want to tackle this dignity issue?
Yeah, and thank you for raising it, because I think it's an incredibly important point. And as Ground Truth, we borrow some techniques from things like market research, but obviously we're not hoping for the same outcomes in terms of satisfaction. A satisfaction survey on Coca-Cola versus a satisfaction survey on an underfunded aid response in a war zone. And so we do have to sort of temper our expectations in terms of what sort of outcomes we're looking for through this process. I was working with OCHA before, and I was going through this process with our humanitarian program cycle team to try and get perception indicators embedded into humanitarian response plans so that there was some way of tracking satisfaction alongside the objectives of a response. And Syria was the first country who wanted to do this, but they had a statistic, and I'm going to get it wrong, so this isn't correct, but it was something like 8% satisfaction. And they said, we still want to put it in there, but could the target be like 20, so that we're not saying that aid is going to make people feel like their whole lives are better, but we really need to be accountable for at least trying to improve that. And I think the reason why we keep bringing up dignity so much is that we don't ask people a question, do you feel dignified in your day-to-day life? Because it's kind of a weird question. But we do have questions that would indicate, when you start adding up the different responses to those questions, that perhaps people's lives aren't as dignified as we perhaps think they are. So if they're receiving cash and that is giving them an element of choice, which maybe they will tell us they appreciate, if they have to go to their neighbours, like one of the examples that we had on the slide, to ask how to do that, or if they feel that they have no information or they can't plan because they haven't been told when the next cash transfer is coming, they feel completely in the dark about the process. I think when we have enough of those indicators that we kind of put together, we can draw some conclusions about dignity. And so while we don't have a hard and fast way of measuring dignity itself, I think it's just a good way for us to provide a check and balance on some of the rhetoric versus some of the concerns that people are raising in the field.
Thank you. Fantastic. And just to tackle your question about cash versus community exchange from a much less technical perspective, we had interesting conversations inside CALP when we looked at the draft of the cash barometer at this graph in particular to say, does this make sense? Is it comparing apples and oranges to say my need is cash versus my need is shelter, because those are just different families of things. And I think with the conclusion we came to, which I'm sure the same conclusion that you came to, is that saying my main need is cash is a proxy for saying give me the means to make my own choices, right? So I don't think, certainly in what we know, and you guys may have different research on this, but people aren't particularly hung up on the delivery mechanism itself. I think Ground Truth research comes back consistently to say the mechanism through which I receive the means to buy goods and services is not what matters to me. It's the means itself, and it's the process that goes around that. So we give this graph a thumbs up because we know that it's two different categories of things, but we know what it's saying also. We've got time for maybe one more quick round of questions if there are any. Any more questions, comments, thoughts?
Thanks for this. This is super interesting. I'm curious, I guess in the accountability work, if you found any, if you looked at localization and if there's any differences with local actors versus international actors. And I guess the same for yours, on the 4 scenarios where you'd see, I mean, I guess it's throughout, right? But if you could just talk a little bit about like the role of local actors in those scenarios.
Great, thank you. Any more questions or thoughts, or should we tackle that? It's a biggie. Tom.
Hi, not so much a question, but more of a thought, and it would be interesting your thoughts on it, is, we're talking a lot about accountability and CVA, but, CVA as a modality along with in-kind, and it's, as part of this discussion, we've got to make sure that we're not putting more responsibility on CVA that isn't on in-kind. There's already a gap in quality or perception of quality between these. So it should be accountability and basic needs provision, CVA, in-kind or cash. And looking at those different elements holistically, I think is a critical part. And I'd be interested if that's something, I know obviously we're Cash Week, but has that cost comparison of accountability of modalities also being looked into?
Brilliant. Thank you. Any final questions? If not, those are both big ones we can tackle. No? Great. Okay. In that case, Ailey, are we all right to start with you for a quick rundown of localization in the different scenarios?
Certainly. I think it operates slightly differently in each scenario, depending on sort of the other factors that are under consideration. So, for example, in the control scenario, we really see local actors as at the forefront because it's more about a national response, and local actors sort of under the scenario have more leeway and more sort of essentially permission and regulation to operate within that space. So in that structure, it certainly is a very aggressive form of localization that's suggested in the international actors would really fall back on being technical experts and then sort of support, but have relatively, very little direct implementation through that. In the chaos scenario, which is more about sort of transnational population movements and looking at how we manage that kind of thing, I think the sort of the idea of localization, ultimately, it is true in all scenarios that the local actors are at the forefront of delivery, mostly because that is true today. The local actors are at the forefront of actual delivery. So it's not something I think that is necessarily news or groundbreaking, but the way in which we as the international humanitarian system interact with them varies. So in that one, the international society has more of a role to play in sort of trying to coordinate and collaborate, across a boundary as people are moving and trying to sort of provide a more continuity, I suppose, in terms of service delivery across those different spaces. I think in the other two scenarios that look at sort of emergence and synergy, it's more interesting to look at in this space, because I think particularly in emergence, even when we talk in control and in chaos, both of those don't necessarily reverse the power structure, which we see within the humanitarian space that exists today, because we're still talking about international organizations sort of either, channeling money or sort of providing some sort of coordination across a system. Whereas in emergence, because we're looking at sort of a more organically grown and highly localized new network, that's something that I think is, that it's not a question of localization in that same, because I think often when we talk about the term localization, that in and of itself is quite a paternalistic way of looking at it, in terms of saying we're going to localize our own resources and our own power by sharing it and by sort of moving it downwards. That one's more about saying we're growing a new organic system that's coming up through some of these local actors and local resources, and the international sector will fit in where it does, but it's not about us transferring some of this or being generous enough to give it. And I think similarly in synergy, it's just about a new relationship in terms of, where people are able to more concretely focus on their expertise, but mostly that the rest of the actors in the system actually show that, acknowledge that value, which I think is different. So I think there are different sort of modalities of localization that are explored in these different scenarios. But I think ultimately it's something that is, well, as I said, reflects the reality of today. The local actors are at the forefront of a lot of the work that's being done. It's just that the relationship changes. And the work that this is based on within the future of aid, really looks at the fact that I think when it was released a few years ago, one of the taglines in the press release was "Change or Die" for INGOs, which was quite dramatic, obviously, being a press release. But it essentially reflected the fact that, I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having today, and it does link in to conversations around respect, around dignity, around some of these things. But I think part of the problem is that even when we have these conversations now, I like the fact that Meg was talking about the fact that, dignity isn't an outcome. But I also think dignity isn't something that we should think about being given. It's something that people have and that we rob them of when we don't acknowledge their capacity, their their own sort of abilities to run their own lives. And I think we're looking at this all the wrong way again when we consider, what modalities do we have to give people dignity? That completely belies the reality that I think exists. And I think in and of itself, asking ourselves those questions is wrong, which is why, and I similarly think that way about localization in terms of, a lot of the discussions we have, because they drill down to the practical nature of, we have X amount of power, how are we sharing it? It still sort of is part of that frame. But once again, we're not seeing the bigger picture of the fact that, lots of local actors are more and more, looking at diversifying their funding streams, are looking at sort of working in different ways. And I think similarly, we're not giving people sort of some of this power, but equally they need to be held to be accountable in the same ways. And I think, that entire system itself is changing, and we will see huge amounts of change in that space in the next 10 to 15 years, whether we do it or not. So ultimately, these scenarios, I think, each try and explore a different dynamic of that broader conversation. And cash is certainly as a way of sort of operating in some of these spaces. Some of the dilemmas that face us about cash face local organizations as well. That's not, it's not necessarily true that local organizations are going to either do all this better and, be far in the green on all of these questions. So I think in some ways we're asking ourselves the same questions, and in some ways it's very different depending on what we're looking at. So, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So having exploded the notion of localization itself, over to you, Meg, for the relationship between localization and accountability, and then any thoughts on the relationship between accountability in cash and in humanitarian assistance more broadly.
I think just on the localisation side, and I won't speak to this too much because it's something that we obviously need to delve into a bit further as Ground Truth and as a sector. Our findings on localisation are increasingly interesting, and the reason for that is that they vary so much. So in a lot of other... So we basically include localisation questions in terms of this bigger question about trust, in terms of who people trust to receive information from or provide information to. And it really varies across the board, but quite often international responders are actually, people consider them more trustworthy in terms of these dialogues. But the way that my brilliant colleague Elias analysed this in terms of his blog, which you should all read when it comes out because he put it way better than I did, was that is as real as it is unfair. And so it's very difficult for us to then draw conclusions about, oh, well, that means that therefore we shouldn't be, we should continue to exist into all eternity and that localisation doesn't work, because that may be because person X in camp X sees more of an international agency because they just have more money to operate there, or that they have an accountability budget and therefore they're the ones asking the questions. And so we soon realise that while we have findings that are very interesting in terms of the ability to draw conclusions about that for accountability, I think it's still quite difficult for us. So I know that that's not really an answer, but I would just say that it's definitely something that requires more thought. To your point about overall accountability, definitely I've tried to do my best to cashify my understanding of accountability, but as Ground Truth and as a sector, there is definitely a move both in practice and policy towards collective approaches to accountability that aren't based on sector. So they're not necessarily focused on cash. We, as an agency, have decided to focus on cash because it is such a kind of cross-cutting, emergent modality. But generally, approaches look at overall accountability in terms of how people perceive and experience aid. And so I wouldn't say that it's specific to cash or that there's more onus on cash providers. I would say that there's potentially more opportunity for cash providers just because it is this kind of cross-cutting way of providing aid that does tend to enable people, not give, but enable them to kind of live lives in a way that is a little bit more dignified if done properly. So I don't think that it's like a cash responsibility as much as it's everyone's responsibility.
Brilliant. Thank you guys so much. Could we borrow Jenny Caswell from GSMA up here so people can see you? We have thrown a lot of information your way. We've done a lot of talking. And so now is time to caffeinate, grab some carbohydrates, and then we are handing the baton over to you to start doing the hard work. And I've done endlessly scrolling. Brilliant. So we're going to give you half an hour to grab some coffee and some snacks. And then when we come back, we're going to be in 3 different groups. So we've kind of bundled the recommendations that I went through earlier into 3. So Jenny from GSMA is going to be in that corner of the room where Rose is, and she's going to be leading us through seeing cash in a broader context, seeing cash as one of multiple flows, and how we deal with people on the move, increasing numbers of people on the move. So if you want to dive into those 2 recommendations after the break, please come back and be with Jenny over in that corner. Group 2 is going to be led by Meg, and she is going to be upstairs in the underwrite room. Rose will show us the way there after the coffee break, and she'll be looking at what it means to put people at the centre and maintaining the trust relationship. So if you're interested in looking at those 2, please follow Meg after the break upstairs. And then Ailey will be leading group 3, which will be over there by the coat rack in the other corner of this room, looking at evaluating our collective impact and what it means to get to grips with data responsibility. So if you have a burning interest in the first of one and the second of another, feel free to switch after 45 minutes because you'll have an hour and a half. But in general, we'd encourage you to pick one group and stick with it. And what you'll be doing in these groups, led through by your facilitator, is looking at 5 questions. What are the implications coming out of the scenarios that will be challenging? What steps are we already taking to address this? What more do we need to do? And that will be the main focus of the discussion. What are the key barriers to progress? And then at the end, we'll have a quick think about whether there are any recommendations missing from our list that have jumped out at you. So I will leave this up on the board and leave you to go and grab some coffee and cakes. Before you do so, just a huge round of applause to our 2 brilliant presenters. That was fantastic.